Hello my friends, welcome to a video on somatic sensory pathways. We're just moving down the road. We've tried to cover a lot about somatic sensation, get you a lot of detail there. And where are we at now? Now we're looking at the pathway, the ascending pathway, taking that sensory information up. And remember, we're only somatic right now. We're leaving the visceral because I feel like we covered that pretty well in chapter 15, right? With the autonomic nervous system, all from the viscera. What about the special senses? Well, we're leaving that for the next chapter, chapter 17, next week. And we'll really cover all the sensation from the eyes, from the nose, auditory, from the ears, equilibrium also from the ears, gustation from the tongue. We'll cover all that in chapter 17 and those mechanisms and details. Now we're really focusing on the exteroceptors and the information and the proprioceptors and the information that they're going to send up the sensory pathways to the brainstem or up to the cerebral cortex. So what are we going to do? First thing we'll do is we'll look at the pathway. I'm going to break apart a first order, second order, and third order neuron and sort those out A through C. Then we'll go to 4 through 8 and we'll just match those up. And there'll be a little bit of overlap because there's 7, D through J. There's 7 on the right, 5 on the left. A couple of those will have to ping twice. But we'll separate out the ALS and the two parts of the DCML, the medial and the lateral part, the gracial and the cuneate. And then the trigeminal thalamic and also the spinocerebellar. We'll sort out which pathway fits this description of D through J. And that, my friends, is how we will test ourselves when we're done. So here is the pathway in general, not the DCML or the ALS specifically, but the general overview of the somatic sensory pathway, how you get somatic sensory information, exteroceptor information, proprioceptive information to the CNS, either the low brainstem or up to the cerebral cortex. You start off with your exteroceptors. So either your Merkel's disc, your Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles, paratracheal hair reflexes, Ruffini corpuscles, free nerve endings. We've seen that all in the last video. If any of that is confusing you, go back and watch the previous video on somatic sensation. Or your proprioceptors, your muscle spindles, your tendon organs, or your joint kinesthetic receptors. And they're going to send on their way with a first order neuron. And it's going to be a spinal nerve, if it's down here in the outer part of the integumentary system, in the torso, in the limbs, in the neck, in the head. It's going to be back of the head. It's going to be a spinal nerve, and it's going to feed a first order neuron into the central nervous system. And it could be, let's see, one of these two. Let's say it's from a muscle spindle. It would come out. Muscle spindle, remember these two, the diagram's not very big. Go back to the previous module to watch if you want. But these are sensory information from the muscle spindles telling you about muscle length. Right? And they just come right along. Let's say they come along and they enter the posterior root, right? They go through the posterior root, the cell body is in the posterior root ganglion, and in they go, and they just start ascending up until about here. This is where the first order neuron ends at a decussation. Or it could be coming out of the, let's see, Meissner's corpuscle free nerve. You see these nerve endings coming out, and they may do the same thing, run right into the posterior root and the posterior horn of the posterior root ganglion, where the cell body is, then into the posterior gray horn, and up they might go, up until they decussate, right? So they're going to be ipsilateral up until the point at which they decussate. And if it's trigeminal thalamic pathway, it'll be from a cranial nerve. We'll show you that when we get into the trigeminal. So this would be spinal nerve. It's coming from any of the integumentary system, from the back of the head, neck, trunk, upper limbs, lower limbs, or any muscles or any joints there. If it's coming from the face, it'll be carried by a cranial nerve, 5, and a little bit of 7, but mostly 5. What about a second order neuron? Well, that's going to be the green line, and that's going to be trucking it up. So from the decussation, all right, the decussation is going to occur at the end of the end of the first order neuron, and then the decussation through the second. And the second order neuron will take it from wherever it decussates or crosses, and it will cross somewhere in the CNS. It might cross all the way down at the segmental level, the spinal cord, if it's the ALS. If it's the DCML, it'll go up and it'll cross in the medulla. Either way. If it's the trigeminal thalamic, it might decussate in the medulla, it might in the pons, might decussate in the pons too. Either way, The second order neuron is taking it from that decussation up to the thalamus. And that's the relay station. We always want to get to the thalamus. And then the third order neuron in blue over here connecting the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. And that's going to be, do you remember what nuclei they come out of? Remember that? So if it's the DCML or the ALS, it comes out of the VPL. So this is the ventro. Everything in blue forward is all ventro, right? But you're in the posterior part of the ventro compartment, and you're lateral. So the VPL handling the information from the DCML or the ALS. Go back to the thalamus video if you're unsure about that. Whereas the VPM will handle the trigeminothalamic pathway information, right? Remember those? Go back and check it out if you don't know. It's totally okay. Just go back and refresh. And how are they getting there? They're moving up on projection fibers. Remember? So these are no longer sensory tracts per se. The DCML and the ALS, they all run on the trigeminothalamic. They all run out at the thalamus. They end at the thalamus. But we're just continuing now, and we're using projection fibers, the internal capsule, the corona radiata. Remember those? Moving within a hemisphere vertically, inferiorly, superiorly, vertically, if you will, up from the thalamus up to the cerebral cortex and to the specific place on the sensory homunculus. What is a sensory homunculus? I'll get to that in a couple slides. And that's the third order neuron connecting the thalamus to the cortex, the primary somatosensory area. Remember, this is all going to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. All right, coming from exteroceptors to there via the thalamus. Let's break it out and parse it out. We know the DCML is carrying the happy, right? Light touch, discriminative touch, light pressure, vibration, and proprioception. From the limbs, the trunk, the neck, and the posterior head. Remember, we're leaving everything but this for the trigeminothalamic, right? Trigeminothalamic here. Everything else is either DCML or ALS, back of the head, neck, trunk, upper limbs, lower limbs, depending on whether it's DCML or ALS will depend on what type of stimulation it's sending. So the DCML gets the happy, the ALS gets the crappy, gets the pain, crude pressure, the itch, the temperature, hot and cold temperature. ALS gets that and it sends it up. And then the trigeminothalamic carries both the happy and the crappy from the face, nasal cavity, teeth, all those areas. Right? And then the fourth one, those first three are sort of true, how can we call it? True thalamic pathways. Right? The ALS, the DCML, and the trigeminothalamic are true pathways to the thalamus. What if you want to run all this important proprioception into the cerebellum instead? And you do. You really want to get that information to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is 100% on top of the movement of every joint and the position of every joint in space and the length of every single muscle that you have and the acceleration and deceleration of all your joints, right? The spinocerebellar pathway is what's going to take that all up to the cerebellum. So let's break it down and look at the DCML or the PCML. Use either one completely interchangeably. Dorsal column medial lemniscus or posterior column medium lemniscus. Both the same. You're going to have it broken into two. You're going to need to be able to break it into the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus. And the gracile fasciculus is medial. It's the more medial of the two. And the cuneate is a little bit lateral. And you're also going to need to know where it's coming from. The gracile is picking up all of your happy sensation, your light touch, light pressure, vibration, proprioception, all of that from the lower limbs, from the lower trunk. Right? Whereas the cuneate is carrying it from the upper limbs and the upper trunk. How are you going to remember that? Well, go back to 40A. Pretty simple. The gracile nucleus. Gracile nucleus, a fasciculus in this case, going up to the gracile nucleus. The gracile fasciculus. Do you remember where it was? Do you remember the muscle? The gracilis, do you remember where it was? It was on your lower body, right? The gracilis is connecting from about your inguinal groin region, pubic region, down to your knee. So remember that the gracile fasciculus handles information from the lower trunk and the lower limbs because that's where the gracilis muscle is, right? And remember where gracilis was? Supermedial, right? Like on the inside of your leg. So put the gracile fasciculus, put the gracile, I'll put a G, make that one the more medial of the two. You can see this blue area. For one, it's divided segmentally into right and left, but on just the right-hand side, which I'm looking at here, which would be the left-hand side of the person, either way, the more medial column is going to be gracile, and the more lateral is going to be cuneate. And you can remember that because gracilis is a completely medial muscle. It's on the medial aspect of the thigh. Just some easy ways, hopefully, to remember that. Where do they decussate? They do not decussate at the spinal level. Everything is ipsilateral, moving up until you get to the great sensory decussation at the medulla. Right? And they cross over at the great sensory decussation. What a great name. Cross over, and then they run contralaterally. So information from the right side of the body will now be found, putting matching circled X's, will now be found on the left side ascending. But remember, after the decussation, don't look for a dorsal column. Look for its other name after the decussation, the medial lemniscus. Dorsal column before the decussation, medial lemniscus after the decussation. And a lemniscus is a ribbon. So that's pretty easy to keep track of. And what do I have? Yeah, so caudal to the pons, it's called the dorsal column, or caudal to, so basically caudal to the pons, that's fine. It's called the dorsal column, and then through the upper medulla and into the pons, it becomes the medial lemniscus. No problem at all there. We can track that super easy. Let's go to the ALS, carrying your pain, your nasty temperatures, itch, tickle. I don't know if tickle's crappy sensei. Well, yeah, tickle can be kind of painful too. At any rate, you're coming in from the whole body, right? So anywhere in the whole body, everywhere. So trunk, lower limbs, upper limbs, neck, posterior head. Now there's no differentiation. There's no differentiation really between whether it's coming from the lower or the upper. It all kind of piles in, and you can see it entering, and again, through the posterior root, and then through the posterior root ganglion where the cell body is, entering the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord, decussating across, and then either jumping onto the anterior or the lateral. Doesn't make any difference. They just kind of ride up side by side. Anterior or lateral. You can see them riding side by side. They've already decussated, so they're already contralateral. Up they go through the medulla. No need to decussate again. Through the midbrain. And remember what we're looking for? Do you remember the name of the path that we're looking for? Or the area in the midbrain when we do a cross section? Remember that's called the spinal lemniscus, right? Inside the spinal lemniscus, that's where we know we have our ALS path. We have these ascending tracks of both the anterior and the lateral spinal thalamic tracts moving up. And where are they going? You know where they're going. They're going straight to the thalamus. Second order neuron. So first order neuron coming into the gray horn. Second order neuron coming, decussating and coming all the way up. And then the third order neuron, of course, running along a white association tract, projection tract, the internal capsule, corona radiata, running from the thalamus all the way up. And again, it's the VPL, right? The ALS and the DCML go into the VPL, the ventroposterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, and then they synapse there. Ride a third order neuron, i.e. a white association tract, internal capsule, or corona radiata, and ride it up to the somatosensory cortex. Again, we'll take a look at the motor homunculus in just a second. The motor homunculus, the sensory homunculus. That's kind of where it's actually going to go. We're saying, oh, it goes to the primary somatosensory area, but specifically, we can look at how that's broken down in that area to what specific region on a coronal section, and we'll show you the homunculus in just a bit. All right, and then finally, from the face, trigeminal thalamic, right? From the face, trigeminal thalamic. And it's going to be carrying everything, happy and careful. So light touch, pressure, itch, temperature, pain, all from the face is going into the trigeminal thalamic pathway. Remember, the trigeminal is cranial nerve number 5, the big daddy. It carries sensory and motor out. So you're going to find the cell bodies. The first order neurons are going to start sensory-wise in the face. They're going to carry into the trigeminal ganglion, and that's going to be where the first order. So the first order, let's say, let's just put your nose right here, right? So you got something going on inside your nose that hurts. And that neuron is going to come in first order, and it will synapse on a cell body in the trigeminal ganglion. This nerve has its own ganglion sitting just lateral to the pons. Second order neuron will pick up, and it will cruise in. They're showing it on the other side. I'm just doing it on this side, so no big deal. Second order neuron will cruise in and will decussate and come up. I'm just doing the opposite of what they've drawn. And it will come right up through and on to the thalamus. And then there, the second order neuron will terminate, synapse with the third order neuron, which will then take it up to, of course, the primary somatosensory area. So I just drew the exact same thing on the opposite side as what your book drew. And then there's a little loop too, just bear this in the back of your mind. As it actually enters in the pons, it can actually descend real quick to the medulla and then decussate at the medulla and then go back up and join the trigeminal thalamic. And again, the trigeminal thalamic has 3 nuclei. It's got nuclei in the medulla, it's got nuclei in the pons, and it's got nuclei in the midbrain. So it can actually decussate, can go down and decussate at a nucleus in the medulla. It can decussate right at the level it comes in at the pons, or it can ascend and then decussate at the midbrain and go up too. So it can decussate in any one of the midbrain, in the brainstem areas. No big deal there. That's kind of really more trivial than anything else. And cranial nerve 5 is carrying most of it, right? Cranial nerve 7 is involved a little bit, mostly cranial nerve 5. And 9 a little bit, tiny bit too. So 5 the big one, 7 and 9 just a little bit. Remember that 1, 2, 7, 8, and 10, 9 and 10 carry special sense information. And then and visceral. So 1, 2, and 8 are carrying special sense information, and then 10 and 9 too, and then 10 is carrying all your visceral information. So just to remember that this is somatic information, not special, not visceral. We did that later, and we'll do that a little bit later. 15 for visceral, chapter 17 for special. Okay? We're right in the middle with somatic. All right, so now you're going to come up to the primary somatosensory area. We know where we're going. We're going right to the 1, 2, and 3, the primary somatosensory area. But now we're going to take this lateral view, and you're going to rotate it real quick to a frontal view. And along this primary somatosensory area, you're going to do a little look, and you're going to say, well, okay, what if we take a slice this way, and we take a coronal section, wrapping over onto the medial side too, down the longitudinal fissure. Well, where would we actually be going? Would we be going superiorly? Would we be going in mid-range? Would we be going around on the medial side? Well, it depends on what type of sensation from what part of the body. And that's where we build a sensory homunculus. And a sensory homunculus is just simply a cartoon sketch of the areas of the body in a coronal section. So again, I'm going to go back and forth a couple of times so you can see this is animation. This is cheap animation. Take the brain and rotate it to a coronal section. So take a section right through the brain. We're going to come right through this primary somatosensory area, and we rotated it. All right, now we're looking straight on at a coronal section of the primary somatosensory area. And down to, nothing goes below the central sulcus. So remember, this is the central sulcus, and the primary somatosensory area is only superior to the central sulcus because it's only in the parietal lobe, right? Again, let's go back. Let's look. It's only going to be in the parietal lobe, just posterior to the central sulcus. Sorry, did I say central? I meant lateral. So again, slow down. This is the central sulcus. It's all going to be posterior to the central sulcus, which you can't see in a coronal. But what you see is it's all going to be superior. What areas 1, 2, and 3 are all, this area right here is where the motor or the sensory homunculus is going to be built. It's all going to be superior to this lateral sulcus. Right? And you'll see that lateral sulcus is what I was trying to indicate here. This is the lateral sulcus. Everything below this is the temporal lobe. Everything above is the parietal. And we know that the sensory homunculus, sorry, I keep saying, there is a motor homunculus. We'll do that next video. We'll be happy because I said it about 8 times. The sensory homunculus only occurs in the parietal lobe, and it's only in that primary somatosensory area. But again, it wraps medial. Now, what is this weird drawing? It's like a Salvador Dali here. It is going to represent the amount of cortical area in the primary somatosensory area that's dedicated to each body part. And that, of course, is going to be a function not of the size of the body part. It's going to be the function of the number of exteroceptors and proprioceptors that you have in that body part. The lips are full of receptors, sensory receptors. Look how big the area is in this homunculus. Look how large the amount of, how much cerebral cortex is dedicated to the lip. This, my friends, is the entire trunk. Can we not argue about the fact that the trunk The trunk is way bigger than the lips, but look at how small an area, because the trunk is not a huge proprioceptive or exteroceptive area to be receiving, but the lips are huge. The fingers, look at the amount dedicated to the fingers. Why? Fine motor skills, what separates us from an alligator, right? That ability to make intricate, exquisite little movements. You need so many receptors and proprioceptive information and touch and discriminative feel in your fingers to make those incredible fine motor movements. So look at the area of the homunculus dedicated to receiving from your fingers. Hopefully that will make sense looking at that sensory homunculus. And then lastly, do not forget that great proprioceptive information that is not going all the way up. We are not going all the way up to the cerebral cortex, which exists rostral to this diagram. This is Ninja Nerd's artwork, and they always put the cerebellum right here. This is always the cerebellum. And so, what about the spinocerebellar information, that really great proprioceptive information coming from a proprioceptor? I'll put a P over here. Anywhere in the body, anywhere at all in the body, a proprioceptor, bringing their information in, posterior root in the posterior cell body in the posterior gray horn. In it goes, and then, or the dorsal root ganglia, posterior root ganglia, that's why DRG is right there. And in it goes, and remember, it is always ipsilateral. So entering the posterior gray horn, looping around, and then either in the posterior spinocerebellar tract, which I just put a circle on, or the anterior spinocerebellar tract, doesn't make any difference, into the posterior in this case, and then up it goes, stays ipsilateral, and then it enters into the medulla and takes a quick shoot off into the via the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is drawn as a sort of tube or this opening, and on what are called climbing or mossy fibers, it enters into the cerebellum, and it brings that really great information to the folia, the external gray matter, cerebellar gray matter of the cerebellum. And that's telling the cerebellum all about what's going on proprioceptively in every single aspect of the body. So first order neuron coming in, and then synapsing, and then, so this is the first order neuron. There's only 2 orders in this when you go to the cerebellum, not 3. And then the second order neuron coming up and ascending. But don't be looking for a third order neuron like with the ALS and the DCML. Look for just a first and a second order neuron to get to the cerebellum. And remember, ipsilateral, information from this side of the body, the right side of the body, is going to the right cerebellum. And same thing over information from the left, and that's completely opposite, right? We know that information from the right side of the body via the DCML ALS goes to the left cerebral cortex and the left sensory homunculus, right? But in terms of the spinocerebellar, it remains ipsilateral. That's just something you want to remember. And then last but not least, remember who knows everything, except for olfaction. Because you can't really know everything, but you can know close to everything, right? And that's the reticular formation. So conceptually, all these pathways we just described, they're ascending, they're giving off collaterals as they run right smack through the reticular formation. Shown, I'll outline it, this big purple area that runs right through the center of the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. And as these DCML comes up, as the ALS comes up, it's giving collaterals and just sending all its information. It's going right on by, and as it goes by, it just tells the reticular formation what the information is it's sending. So reticular formation is picking up everything from the DCML, everything from the ALS, everything from the trigeminal thalamic. So it knows everything except, of course, for olfaction or smell. Here we go. First order neuron is going to be a spinal or a cranial nerve. Spinal, DCML, ALS, cranial nerve for the trigeminal thalamic, no big deal. From an extero or a proprioceptor, and it's going to head into the lower part of the CNS. And it might be going, and it might be ready to decussate in the spinal cord, or it might go up to the brainstem to decussate, either way. Second order neuron is going to be a neuron that decussates somewhere in the lower part of the CNS, either at the segmental spinal level, or in the medulla or the pons, or even in the midbrain, no big deal. Then it's going to ascend to the thalamus. And then your third order neuron will be running from the thalamus. Now it's no longer part of the sensory pathway. Now it's a white matter projection tract, and it's running via the internal capsule or via the corona radiata, and it's running from the thalamus up to the somatosensory cortex, primary somatosensory area, to whatever part of the sensory homunculus it came from. If it came from the toes, it's going to the toe area of the sensory homunculus. If it came from the lips, it's going to the lip area. If it came from the upper limbs, or the elbow, it's going to the elbow area in that homunculus. Anyway, ALS. What does the ALS bring? It brings pain, itch, temperature, crude pressure from the lower limbs and the lower trunk. But wait, there's more. It also brings pain, itch, temperature, crude pressure, vibration, from the upper, so pain, itch, temperature, and crude pressure from the upper limbs and upper trunk, as well as from the lower limb and lower trunk. So they're both on the ALS. What I'm trying to get at this point is with the ALS, you don't split out upper and lower. But wait till we get to the DCML, and then I am going to split it out into gracile, lower body, and cuneate, upper body, right? But with the ALS, don't split it out. It's going to receive crappy sensation, pain, itch, temperature, all that from the upper and the lower limbs and the upper and the lower trunk. Trigeminal thalamic is going to receive, let's see, pain, itch, temperature, crude pressure from the face, the nasal and oral cavities, and the teeth. But wait, it's also going to receive light touch too. So my point is the trigeminal thalamic doesn't split out the type of sensory. It handles everything from the face. Nice light touch to painful stimulation of the face. It handles everything. And it brings it all in on the trigeminal thalamic pathway. The DCML, the gracile fasciculus. So that's going to be light touch, light pressure, but from the lower, because remember gracilis, you remember this because gracilis is a lower body muscle, leg muscle. And then that leaves the cuneate fasciculus to bring in light touch from the upper limbs, G, and the upper trunk and the upper limbs and the neck and the posterior head. And that leaves, of course, not last but not least, somatic proprioception from the entire body travels on the spinal cerebellar to the cerebellum. Done and done. Thank you very much. Short, not short, but sweet, hopefully. And then we're just going to finish up this chapter with looking at the motor pathways, the somatic motor pathways, your corticospinal and then your subcortical, vestibulo, tecto, rubero, and reticulospinal pathways. So I'll see you there, and thanks for watching and sticking with this.